Welcome to the Golden Gems podcast. Today we're taking a deep dive into Alexander Shulgin, the prolific rogue chemist who synthesized over 200 compounds in a backyard shed and forced the DEA to raid him.
It is an incredible story.
It really is. But before we get to the raid or, the shed itself, I want you to just pause and look at the profound paradox we are living in right now, today, in 2026. Because right now, the mainstream medical establishment and the FDA are quietly integrating the exact molecular architecture mapped out by a man they once spent massive federal resources trying to destroy.
Yeah, it's a staggering contradiction. I mean, the very compounds he synthesized in this dusty, spider-infested shed in Lafayette, California, are currently the foundation of multi-million-dollar clinical trials.
Right. We're talking specifically about MDMA.
Exactly. The FDA has given MDMA breakthrough therapy designation for treating severe post-traumatic stress disorder. And, breakthrough isn't just some pharmaceutical buzzword. It is a specific fast-track designation for drugs that show massive clinical superiority over everything else currently available.
Which is wild.
It is. So the identical state apparatus that raided his laboratory, revoked his federal licenses, and slapped him with massive fines is now validating the exact chemical blueprint that he mapped out and just, gave away for free.
And he never asked for permission to do it. He didn't wait for a university grant or institutional approval. He simply built the tools, explored the deepest territories of human consciousness, and published the exact coordinates for anyone to find.
He absolutely did.
So, for you listening, think of this deep dive as a forensic breakdown. We're going to look at how one individual managed to outmaneuver a multi-billion-dollar federal law enforcement apparatus just by giving away the source code.
Right.
But to understand how he pulled this off, we really have to rewind. Because he wasn't born a rebel. He was actually the product of an incredibly rigid traditional environment.
Very rigid. Alexander Theodore Shulgin was born in 1925 in Berkeley, California. And you really have to look at the household that shaped him to understand his methodology. His father was a Russian immigrant who navigated all the geopolitical chaos of the early 20th century just to get to the United States.
Wow.
Yeah. And his mother was born in Illinois. But here's the kicker. They were both strict public school teachers in Alameda County.
Right, so education was everything.
Exactly. They treated the pursuit of empirical knowledge as the absolute highest law. They enforced this relentless, almost mechanical efficiency in him when it came to reading and the sciences.
Which, turned him into a child prodigy.
It did. He absorbed scientific literature at a terrifying pace, and that environment propelled him straight into the elite corridors of higher education way before he was emotionally ready. I mean, by the early 1940s, at the age of 16, he had secured a scholarship to study organic chemistry at Harvard University.
Okay, Harvard in the 1940s. For you listening, I can only imagine how stiff that must have been. It's defined by this dense, hierarchical approach to the physical sciences.
Oh, entirely.
He's suddenly immersed in the structural mechanics of molecular bonds, these rigid laboratory protocols, and a culture of heavy theoretical memorization. And he's 16.
Right.
That chronological anomaly must have been incredibly isolating for him. The academic culture of that era was all about looking at matter on a chalkboard, but he actually wanted to manipulate it.
And that tension is what ultimately snapped. I mean, the geopolitical rupture of the Second World War finally pierced that insular bubble of Cambridge. So in 1943, at age 18, Shulgin just abandoned the prestige of Harvard entirely.
He's walked away.
He enlisted in the United States Navy. Talk about a brutal transition. He went from the theoretical abstraction of an Ivy League lab to the sensory-deprived reality of naval warfare, serving on a destroyer escort called the USS Pope in the North Atlantic.
And this brings us to a moment that completely altered the trajectory of his life. And honestly, the trajectory of modern chemistry.
It's a fascinating pivot.
Imagine you are 18 years old. You're in a naval medical bay awaiting surgery for a severe infection. A military nurse walks up and hands you a glass of orange juice.
Right.
She points to some undissolved powder at the bottom of the glass and explicitly tells you, drink this. It's a powerful sedative to knock you out before the operation. So, operating under the absolute belief that he just ingested some heavy-duty military pharmaceutical, Shulgin drinks it, experiences a rapid physiological collapse, and falls into a deep, completely unresponsive sleep.
He's totally out.
The surgeons do their work while he is completely unconscious.
Right, and when he finally wakes up, he does what any analytical chemist would do. He starts aggressively interrogating the medical staff.
He wants the data.
Exactly. He wants the exact nature of the sedative, the molecular weight, the dosage, and the revelation they gave him completely dismantled his entire understanding of pharmacology.
Because the powder was just standard table sugar. It was inert sucrose.
Just sugar and orange juice.
For you listening, think about how wild that is. It's like thinking you need a massive external software update to fundamentally change how a computer behaves, only to realize the operating system was already fully capable of executing the command on its own. You just needed a prop to hit enter.
That is the perfect way to frame it, because that was his exact realization, and it both terrified and fascinated him. He understood, lying in that hospital bed, that the human mind possessed the autonomous capacity to generate profound physiological states based entirely on belief and expectation.
The chemical was just a prop.
The actual machinery of unconsciousness was completely internal. And if a fraction of a gram of sugar could render him totally unconscious, he realized the human nervous system was hiding latent powers that nobody was mapping.
That is such a massive paradigm shift, and it drove him straight back to academia. He gets his PhD in biochemistry at UC Berkeley in 1955, focusing on how neurochemical systems interact with metabolism.
Right.
But here's the problem. Berkeley gave him the technical skills, but it was still academia. It was conservative. They demanded incremental progress, narrow specialization, constant grant writing.
Which he hated.
Exactly. He realized that to truly map human consciousness, he needed total operational autonomy. He needed massive funding and zero oversight. And he found it in the absolute last place you would expect a psychedelic pioneer to look.
He went corporate. After a brief stint at Bio-Rad, Shulgin transitioned to the Dow Chemical facility in Walnut Creek, California.
Right.
Now, Dow Chemical in the mid-20th century was the physical manifestation of industrial-scale chemical engineering. We are talking massive funding, the most advanced technological apparatus on Earth, and very simple mandate synthesized compounds that make us money.
And he did. And this is where I really have to push back on the traditional trope we all have of the clandestine chemist. Usually we picture clandestine chemists as anti-capitalist counterculture figures operating outside the system.
Right, running from the man.
But Shulgin explicitly leveraged the ultimate capitalist machine. He invented a blockbuster agricultural pesticide called Zectran for Dow Chemical to bankroll his exploration of the human psyche.
Zectran was huge. I mean, it was the first fully biodegradable pesticide, and it dominated a massive sector of the global agricultural market.
It made them a fortune.
Staggering financial returns for Dow. And Shulgin was a pragmatist. He understood the mechanics of power and capital. In exchange for essentially printing money for the corporation, Dow executives granted him an unprecedented degree of freedom.
Yeah.
He used the company's resources, their state-of-the-art laboratories, and their chemical precursors to synthesize and test his own psychoactive compounds.
He essentially purchased his cognitive liberty with corporate profits. But eventually he outgrows Dow. In 1966, he leaves to build the farm, which is literally just a converted shed on his property in Lafayette, California.
Just a shed.
And this brings us to 1976. This is the turning point. How does he go from agricultural pesticides to resurrecting MDMA?
Well, MDMA wasn't actually a new invention. It was a dormant patent from 1912, originally filed by the German pharmaceutical company Merck.
Okay.
They thought it might be a blood-clotting agent, realized it wasn't, and it just sat completely ignored in the chemical literature for over 60 years. Shulgin found the molecular blueprint, resynthesized it in his Lafayette shed, and began his rigorous protocol of self-experimentation.
And what he found completely broke the mold of what a psychoactive drug was supposed to be.
Entirely.
Unlike classical psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin, MDMA didn't produce visual hallucinations. You didn't see the walls melting. Instead, it generated this profound emotional openness, radical empathy, and the complete dissolution of psychological defense mechanisms.
Right.
Users suddenly had the ability to access deeply suppressed, terrifying traumatic memories without the fear response activating.
And he recognized instantly that this was not a party drug. He called it his low-calorie martini, but what he meant was that it was a precision psychiatric tool.
Yeah.
He started quietly distributing MDMA to a trusted network of licensed therapists across California. And the clinical results were staggering. Patients with severe PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, and end-of-life anxiety were showing dramatic improvements. Between 1977 and 1985, therapists administered an estimated 500,000 doses in these quiet, underground therapeutic settings.
500,000 doses. But of course, therapeutic containment is fragile. You can't keep a compound that powerful a secret forever.
No, you can't.
By the mid-1980s, it escapes the clinical environment, it floods the recreational market, gets rebranded with the flashy street name ecstasy, and becomes the fuel for the emerging rave culture.
Right.
And once it's in the unregulated market, clandestine labs start adulterating it with toxic cutting agents and methamphetamines. People take it in these chaotic, hyper-stimulated nightclubs, and the death toll starts rising. So in 1985, the DEA panics and executes an emergency scheduling order, classifying MDMA as a Schedule A narcotic.
Meaning it has high abuse potential and zero accepted medical use.
Right.
Which sent Shulgin into a profound depression. He was absolutely disgusted by the underground market. He had zero tolerance for people who were adulterating his precise molecular tools just to generate massive profits without giving a damn about the safety or psychological well-being of the user.
Because he saw it as a surgical tool.
Exactly. He had designed this to act as a surgical instrument for trauma, and he had to watch it get consumed in these chaotic environments. But when the state banned it and stripped therapists of their best tool, Shulgin didn't just retreat into his shed.
No, he did the exact opposite. He decided to fight the prohibition by executing an act of total chemical insurrection.
He did.
If the federal government intended to suppress his research and ban the molecule, he was going to weaponize transparency. So in 1991, Alexander and his wife Anne, who was his co-researcher and partner in all this, published a book called Psychedelics, A Chemical Love Story.
Yeah.
And they didn't go through a traditional publisher who could be pressured by the government. They created their own publishing company, Transform Press, to put it out themselves.
And we really need to clarify what Psychedelics actually is. It stands for phenethylamines I have known and loved. A phenethylamine is a specific class of chemical compounds. It's the base structure for things like mescaline and MDMA.
Okay.
The first half of the book is a somewhat fictionalized autobiography, but the second half is pure, unadulterated technical data. It is a manual containing the detailed synthesis pathways, precise dosages, and subjective experience reports for 179 psychoactive compounds.
So when you say synthesis pathway, you mean he literally just published the exact step-by-step recipe cards for how to make these things from scratch?
Precisely, step-by-step instructions. And this is where it's vital to understand his place in the intellectual lineage of the 20th century.
Right.
You had Timothy Leary, who provided the clinical and cultural framework for psychedelics. You had Albert Hofmann, who provided the hardware when he synthesized LSD. You had Terence McKenna mapping out the philosophical software. But Shulgin provided the source code.
The source code.
He synthesized the compounds, tested them on himself, documented the exact molecular weights and reactions, and then published everything for anyone to read.
Publishing PGCal was an open-source software release for human consciousness. He realized that if you decentralize the exact molecular blueprints, if you put the recipes in a book and ship it around the world, no government agency can ever put the genie back in the bottle.
And he didn't stop there. In 1997, again through Transform Press, they published Psychedelics, which stands for tryptamines I have known and loved.
Right.
Tryptamines are a different chemical class, the base structure for compounds like psilocybin and DMT. This book detailed 55 more compounds. That is the essence of weaponizing transparency. He didn't seek institutional validation. He made the data indestructible by distributing it globally.
Because it's out there.
Exactly. His methodology was rigorously empirical. Over the course of his career, he executed more than 4,000 documented self-experiments. He created over 200 unique chemical entities that literally did not exist in the known universe before he synthesized them in that shed.
But with all that transparency, he still held some things back. We have to talk about the unpublished vault.
Oh, the vaults, yes.
Deep inside the Lafayette farm, he kept a collection of 100 alphanumerically indexed glass vials containing uncharacterized compounds. His private notebooks held blueprints for chemicals that even he deemed too profoundly disruptive for public consumption.
Right.
There was one amphetamine derivative he designated as ALEH1. When he tested it, the state of consciousness it induced was so overwhelmingly potent that he explicitly wrote a note to himself to tell no one about the drug. He essentially buried it deep within his appendices to prevent regulation or use.
It shows he had a deep respect for the sheer power of what he was dealing with. But releasing the exact synthesis pathways for 179 illicit adjacent compounds directly challenged the Drug Enforcement Administration's operational calculus.
Yeah, making a tactical strike inevitable.
Exactly, because it completely destabilized his relationship with the DEA. And, for years, Shulgin had actually maintained a functional symbiotic relationship with them.
Which is the most surreal detail of this whole story. The guy inventing new psychedelics in a shed. was a DEA consultant.
He was. He served as an expert witness for them. He authored reference volumes that law enforcement used to identify drugs. And he legally held a Schedule I license to handle these substances.
Wow.
He operated openly. Law enforcement agents would drop by for unannounced inspections of the spider-infested shed, and he would pass every single time without a violation.
But publishing a step-by-step recipe book for psychoactive drugs is going to change that dynamic instantly.
Instantly.
On October 27, 1994, the DEA initiated a massive raid on the farm. They didn't come in saying, "We're mad about your book." They used the bureaucratic pretext of environmental and record-keeping issues.
Right.
They revoked his Schedule I license and slapped him with a $25,000 fine. Richard Meyer, who was a spokesman for the DEA's San Francisco division at the time, just came out and admitted it publicly. He said Peace Kale was essentially an illegal drug cookbook.
The raid shattered the illusion that they were colleagues. The DEA made it abundantly clear that they did not value his empirical data. They valued compliance and control. Mass dissemination of those synthesis protocols wasn't science to them. It was a direct threat to the enforcement infrastructure.
But I have to ask a probing question here regarding the philosophical stakes of what he did. Shulgin believed in absolute cognitive liberty, the idea that you own your mind. But how does that doctrine actually survive contact with the brutal mechanics of underground capitalism?
It's a tough question.
Because we have to talk about the 2CP7 tragedy in 2000. Shulgin synthesized and mapped a compound called 2CT7 in his controlled, meticulous laboratory. He published the pathway in Peace Call, but then clandestine labs read the book, mass-produced this visually potent compound, and sold it to an unprepared recreational market.
Yeah.
And it led to 3 fatal overdoses. He had to bear the moral weight of those 2CT7 deaths when his architectural purity was corrupted by unregulated markets.
It is the absolute philosophical tension of his life's work. He provided the mathematical formulas to alter consciousness, but he had zero control over the sociological environment into which they were released.
Right.
He believed adults had the sovereign right to make informed decisions about their own neurochemistry, but the black market removes the informed part of that equation. He carried the heavy moral weight of those outcomes. And tragically, the fallout of the unregulated market was eventually followed by an even more profound biological tragedy for Shulgin himself.
Yeah. The man who spent his entire life meticulously manipulating the chemical architecture of the human brain was eventually subjected to a catastrophic alteration of his own neurology.
In 2008, he had to undergo massive cardiovascular surgery. And then, in 2010, he suffered a devastating stroke. It damaged the very biological hardware that had processed thousands of novel psychoactive states.
It's heartbreaking.
And that stroke was followed by the onset of dementia. If you think about it, that is the ultimate cruelty for a scientist whose entire legacy relied on forensic cognitive retention and meticulous memory. His physical laboratory had to be permanently shuttered. He passed away on June 6, 2014.
But even as his physical laboratory was shuttered and his biological architecture collapsed, he executed one final defensive maneuver to ensure his work would ultimately conquer the institutions that raided him.
He did.
In 2011, while his health was declining, he published the Shulgin Index, Volume 1. Now, this wasn't a narrative like Peach Cal. This was a sterile, indestructible catalog of empirical chemical data, entirely devoid of emotion. Why? To ensure the coordinates could never be erased by a bureaucracy.
And that final maneuver worked. Which brings us right back to our present reality, April 1st, 2026. Today, organizations like MAPS and the FDA are validating his empirical data. The unmatched efficacy of MDMA in treating combat veterans with severe PTSD is no longer fringe science. It is an undeniable medical reality.
Think about the whiplash here for you listening. The exact same state apparatus that raided his lab, fined him $25,000, and stripped his license is now relying on his exact chemical architecture to treat the psychological fractures of its own military veterans.
It is the ultimate synthesis of his legacy. He proved that the human mind is infinitely malleable, and more importantly, he provided the empirical mathematical formulas to prove it. The Lafayette Farm was arguably the most significant scientific facility of the 20th century that the government could never control.
He firmly established the core philosophical doctrine of cognitive liberty, the sovereign right to alter the interior dimensions of consciousness.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought that you, the listener, really need to mull over. As this data becomes undeniable, How long will the massive institutional apparatus of the state continue to deny the fundamental human right to alter the internal chemical architecture of the mind, when the very molecules they prohibit have already proven to be the most effective tools for healing the deepest fractures of the human psyche?
Thank you for listening to the Golden Gems podcast. We'll be back next time with another deep dive. Until then, keep exploring, keep listening, and keep celebrating the power of uncompromising voices.